Hello everyone. I'm glad you guys were able to find this video. I'm putting this together since y'all couldn't be here. I know this is going to be difficult doing an online classroom, but hopefully we can make it work. We're going to be covering Unit 5, Natural Selection and Evolution. Before we continue on, we should probably review some of the stuff that we talked about before school got let out. Species is just a group of a single type of organism. And organisms are an individual life form. So like white-tailed deer in Blackwater, that's a species. A population is a group of organisms in a particular area. So like white-tailed deer in Blackwater is a population. Some of you may remember this, but species have a very particular definition. Things that qualify as species are, number one, that they can interbreed with each other. And number two, that their offspring can reproduce. Horses and donkeys, for example, they can make mules, but mules are not a species because they cannot reproduce and make more mules. Now, I know natural selection is a large topic and it's hard to cover in just one slide, but natural selection can be summed up in pretty quickly. It's survival of the fittest. Those organisms that are best adapted are able to survive and reproduce. Adaptations are things that help them survive. And if they're able to live long enough to reproduce, they can pass on those adaptations to their offspring. So in the example here, where you have this bird, this is the same species of beetles, red and green, but the bird is selecting the red beetles because they are not adapted for the green leaf. So the green beetles are able to survive longer and reproduce, making more green beetles in that species population. Now we're still reviewing, but natural selection and evolution are both driven by mutations. Now mutations are just small genetic differences between parents and offsprings. These usually happen whenever DNA is copied. Okay, so these small little differences in one copy to another are able to add up over a really long period of time. And then these differences accumulate, you'll eventually get a whole new species. Now that we're done reviewing, we're going to go ahead and talk about what exactly is evolution in Unit 5, Life Over Time. Now evolution is very, very small changes in a population over a really long period of time, leading to a whole new different species, and is driven by three main things: natural selection, mutations, and a long period of time. Since we've already talked about natural selection and DNA mutations, we're going to be talking about the scale of time that evolution occurs over. And you got to understand just how old the Earth really is. It's 4.56 billion years old. And those small changes from natural selection and DNA mutations are going to add up over that really long period of time. In a common case, if you take like a clock and put the entire 4.56 billion years on this clock, you would get something like this, where 1 hour is 570 million years. So life didn't start until about, 1 o'clock, and dinosaurs took about 7 o'clock. That's a long time to go from fish to dinosaurs. So that's what we're talking about, is a very long period of time. Now, there are some common misconceptions about evolution. Number one, only populations can evolve. Individual organisms are not going to be evolving, only populations of organisms. Number two, they don't choose to evolve. The only reason they change into a whole new species is because over a very long period of time, the natural selection and the small mutations and genetic differences between the populations causes a whole new species. And finally, evolution doesn't tell us about how life first appeared on Earth. An example of evolution would be the evolution of horses. 50 million years ago, this is what the ancestor of horses looked like. But today, this is what they look like now. The ancestors had 4 toes. But horses have 4 toes too. They've just been shrunken over time where they're very small and you can't even see them on most horses. What happened was the environment changed where the ancestors lived in forests, and today most modern horses, the wild ones at least, they don't live in forests, they live in grasslands. So they need to run fast, and as the environment changed, those with toes were selected upon and preyed on by other predators, and the fast ones, which likely had this large toe, were able to run faster and get away. Over time, the toes kind of shrunk and were selected upon by natural selection. Now, this next example, we're going to look at the evolution of birds to dinosaurs over 100 million years. Birds and dinosaurs have a lot of similarities, like, for example, their hips and their pelvises and their skeletal structure, but we're going to be looking at going from claws to wings in modern birds. If you look right here, these birds all have the same structure over time. Sorry, these animals all have the same structure over time. It's just that as the environment changed, these structures eventually turned into a wing. Most scientists think that velociraptors and some of the later descendants like Archaeopteryx had wings already. It's just velociraptors probably had small kind of proto feathers. Now that we now understand what evolution kind of is, we're going to be talking about the evidence supporting the theory of evolution, which is going to be right here, and we're going to be diving into each one of these individually. But just remember that these are just one part, the evidence right here, of a scientific explanation that is the theory of evolution. Scientists take this evidence, they reason it out, and they make the best claims they can to support that evidence and that reasoning, coming up with the theory of evolution. Now, the first piece of evidence supporting the theory of evolution is going to be fossils. This fossil right here is a famous fossil. It's Archaeopteryx and is actually the transition fossil between dinosaurs and birds. You can kind of see right here it has feathers, but look at those claws right here too. It's almost got both features of both dinosaurs and birds. This other one is Diartiodon, which is a transitional fossil between whales and the four-legged animals that they descended from. And we're going to be talking more about those later. Now, fossils are all the fossils on Earth that we've discovered, at least, are in the fossil record. All the fossils that we've discovered are from layers of sedimentary rock, where the bottom ones are always going to be the oldest ones, and the newer ones are going to be at the top. And these ones at the bottom are going to be simpler than the ones at the top. The ones at the top are going to be, for example, a little bit more complicated than the ones at the bottom. This is an example right here of a jawless fish. These guys had no jaws at all, no bones in their mouth, and they ate food basically by just inhaling it. And then these fish later on in the fossil record had jaws, and they're a little bit more complicated. So fossils and the fossil record is evidence for the order in which species have existed and how they've changed. So the horse example, you've been able to see how the ancestor had 4 toes, and over time these toes have shrunk, and eventually where you have something like the modern horse. So these newer fossils up at the top are going to resemble the modern organisms, and the older ones are going to be at the bottom, and they're going to resemble their descendants. Now, the next piece of evidence is going to be embryology. Embryology is basically just the study of how embryos develop. And remember, embryos are small, undeveloped life forms that have not yet grown into their adult stage. And embryos all are going to be having a similar stages of development. And in this example, you have chicken and a cat. They both have eyes even early on, and they both have these little limb buds and the curvature of a spine because they're vertebrates. Now, in embryology, embryos change and grow as they develop. Since embryos are really early on in the stage of development, we can kind of see the similarities between completely different species when they're very small and when they're still developing. All of these are vertebrates in the fact that they have a backbone. And if you see, they all develop in similar ways, and they have a tail and they have some kind of gill slits. In this example right here, in a chicken and a cat, you both have eyes early on, and they both have these little limb buds. And this kind of suggests that they share a common ancestor that likely had a tail and gill slits. In this example right here, kind of challenge you to figure out which one of these embryos in A through E is the chicken, and maybe which one is a turtle. Completely different organisms. But they all look very, very similar early on. They all have this tail, and they all have these gill slits. And since they are all vertebrates, they all have backbones, they're all going to be developing kind of the same way. Now, if you keep on going, you start to see they're developing the limb buds, and they still have the gill slits and the tails, okay? In this example, you might be able to tell what he already is. He already has some kind of a fin on his tail. And as they keep on growing on, they lose these tails, and in some cases, and they lose the gill slits, and they wind up in the looking like what they're going to be looking like as a species. This guy right here is a fish, by the way, and as they completely grow into adulthood, you can see the difference in between a chicken and a turtle, but early on, these guys both have the tail and they both have gill slits. Now, this kind of suggests that early on you had some ancestor that had gill slits and tails for all vertebrate animals. Now, the next piece of the evidence supporting the theory of evolution is going to be DNA, specifically the similarities in DNA between organisms. Now, we haven't really been able to talk too much about DNA because of the coronavirus, but we're going to give a quick course over it. Now, the DNA is broken up in these little kind of rungs that you can see going up and down the DNA. And these little rungs that connect the DNA together are these letters that scientists use, and these letters fit together in a specific way. And these letters are representing big, long molecules, these kind of rungs between the different DNA strands right here, okay? Now, the similarity aspect, if you look right here, we're going to be using hippopotamuses and whales as an example throughout these slides, but I bet you didn't know that humans share about 50% of their DNA with bananas. Now, remember, DNA codes for an organism's traits, all right? Now, not all the DNA does. A lot of the DNA, it codes for stuff like proteins or other things that life needs to process, okay? But these little bitty differences in the DNA can cause, that are caused by mutations over a very, very, very long period of time, eventually what lead to natural selection and evolution. In the examples of the hippopotamus and whale, you can see they have similarities between the two right here, between them, and that might suggest that hippopotamuses and whales are closer related than we actually thought. If you look right here, this is called a cladogram, and it kind of plots the relationship between organisms and how closely related they are. If you look right here, you have something like a human and a pig, and they're both mammals and they're both vertebrates, right? They only have a difference of 13 DNA nucleotides, right? And we're talking about a very specific piece of DNA, not the entirety of the DNA, okay? We're talking about the cytochrome oxidase gene, okay? But there's a difference of 13 on this one little gene between the mammals of humans and pigs. But if you look at the difference between the DNA differences on this one gene between a human and a moth right here, there's a lot more differences, okay? That's because moths are insects and humans are mammals, and they're very distantly related, but they still share some similarities in their DNA. Now, the next piece of evidence we're going to be talking about that supports theory of evolution is anatomy, specifically comparative anatomy, where you can compare a crocodile, let's say, to a mouse. And they're very different, but the skeletons are very, very similar. If you look, they both have kind of the same similar bones, even though they might be different in size. Now, in the case of the crocodile and the mouse, that was something called a homologous structure, where they have the same structure, but different functions. In this case, you have humans, whales, and bats. They all basically have the same bones, just in different places. And those different places cause a different function. But they all have a humerus, a radius, carpals, all the different parts of the skeleton are there between these completely different species. And because you have these similarities, it's kind of strong evidence, scientists believe, that all these vertebrates descended from some kind of common ancestor that had the same structure in their bones of the humerus, radius, ulna, metacarpals, and carpals. Now, this is a really good example of homologous structures, where you have the same structure, just different functions. We're going to be taking a look at the arm, leg, a flipper, and a wing, and all these vertebrate animals. Now you look, they all have this humerus right here, bone. They all have the radius. They all have an ulna. They all have the carpals, kind of connecting the toes to the rest of the arm, and they have the metacarpals and phalanges. They all basically have the same structure, but their functions of grasping or walking or swimming or even flying is going to be completely different. Now, what we've been talking about homologous structures, analogous structures are completely different. Analogous structures are similar in function, but they have a completely different structure. If you remember from class previously, homo means same. Well, the A in analogous means without or not. So these guys might have a similar function, but they do not have the same structure. You look at a bat's wing and a butterfly's wing, they both help the animal fly, but they're completely different as far as the structure. Bats have bones, insects do not. Also, in this example, you have a bird and a little Arctic wolf. They both have this camouflage which helps them blend in with the snow, even though this guy has fur and this bird has feathers. Completely different structure, but same function. Now this kind of structures, analogous structures, do not show common ancestry. Just because they have the same function doesn't mean that they're closely related, because it's the similarities in structure that kind of give scientists the clues on how things are closely related. Now, the next kind of structure that we're still talking about anatomy and how anatomy supporting for evolution is vestigial structures. And vestigial structures they are unused and they are basically functionless. And scientists think that they were remnants of some kind of structures from an ancestor. If you look at the snakes right here on this slide, you see right here that you have these snakes have these little bitty kind of claws, and when you look at them in the skeleton view, they're actually connected to entire leg bones right here, and you still have that humerus, radius, and ulna, and the carpals too. So while they don't have any function, they still have a similar structure to their ancestors. And these traces of structures are probably evidence that they share some kind of relation with a common ancestor like lizards. Now, another example of vestigial structures is going to be the hip bones in whales. If you look right here inside of a whale, they all are going to have these small little hip bones that are just the leftovers from their common ancestors. These are unused structures and they are basically functionless, and they're kind of an indication of a remnants of a common ancestor. In the example of whales right here, you have Ambulocetus over 60 million years ago. It had this kind of pelvis and hind limb, And about 40 million years ago in Doordodon, we were talking about that previously with fossils in that picture, this pelvis and the hind limb are very much reduced. And eventually in modern day, you have these whales that all have a very, very small pelvis and shrunken hind limbs that are actually inside the body. So you can see in this picture, this kind of video that's looping, you can see how these limbs are basically, over time, they are shrinking between different organisms. In this example right here, you can see between mammals, they both have basically the same structure. Now, I wish you guys were here, but we're going to try and play a game. So play along with me. And I'm going to give you a picture, and I want to ask, is it analogous, homologous, or vestigial structures? So, is between the bird wing and a human arm, are these analogous, homologous, or vestigial? They're going to be homologous because they have the same structure, but just a different function. You have all these different similarities pointed out by the arrows in these bone structures between birds and humans. Now the next is to show common ancestry because they are homologous and they have the same structure. Yes, they do. In this case, you have an insect wing, a bird wing. Now is it analogous, homologous, or vestigial? This case is analogous. They both have different structure, but the same function of making them fly. Now, does this show common ancestry? No, because they don't have the same structure. They might have the same function, but not the same structure. Now, in this case, we're talking about bat wings and bird wings. Are they analogous, homologous, or vestigial? This case is homologous. They're even color-coded to where you can see the bones are matching up between these two different organisms. Now, does this show common ancestry? Yes, because they have the same structure. In this case, we're talking about Doordodon and modern whales, analogous, homologous, or vestigial. They are vestigial. These pelvises have no function, but they've just shrunken over time. Now, they still have the same structure, just no function. Now, does this show common ancestry between whales and Doordodon with kind of these whales with like limbs on them? Yes, it does, because these limbs are shrinking over time. Now, when we're talking about evolution, evolution is basically descent with modification. And that's a term that Darwin came up with, where it means that over a long, long period of time, all these adaptations are going to build up in the descendants and eventually modify the organism. In this case, in this bird, all the adaptations are eventually building up over a long period of time, and these modifications are causing a whole new different species between the two different birds from a common ancestor. Another example is whales and how the bone structure between the pelvises and the limbs, over time they shrunk and eventually they became useless, and now they're vestigial organs. So descent with modification is basically that organisms have descended with changes over time from a common ancestor. Now, a common example that scientists use to support this claim of descent with modification and the common ancestor is the example of whales that I've been using. But before we ask ourselves, how do we know that animals are descended from a common ancestor? It's important to ask ourselves, what adaptations make whales different from ocean animals like sharks and fish and other things like that? Now, the adaptations that make whales different from other ocean animals is mainly going to be that whales are able to breathe air, give birth to live young, and produce milk. That's because whales are mammals, all right? Whereas sharks are actually more closely related to fish. Whales have bones in their fins, whereas sharks have cartilage. And you can see right here, the bones inside of a whale almost looks like a hand, because they have a similar structure to all vertebrate animals on land. Sharks, on the other hand, their fins are filled with cartilage, and these aren't actually bones at all. It's more muscle and cartilage. Now, these are differences. They might have the same the same function between these two fins, but they have completely different structures. They have different structures in the fins and streamlined body because they're water animals. So in the case of whales, how do we know that these organisms that we found in the fossil record have been descendant from the modern day, or descendants of the modern day whale? We've been talking about how the pelvis has eventually shrunk over time from a limb, and that's the vestigial pelvis, saying that ancestors used to have legs. But there's also DNA similarities between hippos and humpback whales. They both have a large amount of similarities to where that whales likely descended from something kind of closely related to hippos. And they're not terribly related, but there is probably a branching off between one organism that caused whales and another organism that eventually evolved into hippos. They both share a common ancestor. Now, we've been talking about common ancestor a lot throughout these slides, and this can be summed up in the term common descent, where a species, for example, we've been talking about whales, have descended with changes from some kind of common ancestor, some four-legged animal, for in the case of whales, that is walking on land. But this can be applied to all life on Earth. It's the principle of common descent, where all life on Earth shares some kind of similarities with each other and share some kind of ancestor. Thank you for watching this. I'm going to be putting out another video that hopefully will be helpful for you guys about ecology in the next unit. But if you need help in the meantime, you can talk to me on Microsoft Teams. You can email me at this email address, or you can call or text me on my phone right here.